One last discussion to sum up price elasticity of demand is a discussion about consumer surplus. What is consumer surplus? Well, we discussed this earlier. The consumer surplus is the difference between what amount people are willing to pay minus what they actually pay. And we also learned this, that it is the area under the demand curve above the market price. Also, just to wrap it up, we also talked about the idea that when the price goes down, the consumer surplus goes up, because with the same willingness to pay, if the price goes down, what you actually pay goes down, and therefore consumers will pocket a higher consumer surplus. Hence, the lower the market price, the higher the consumer surplus, because when the market price goes down, consumer surplus will go up. On the other hand, when the market price goes up, consumer surplus will go down. Now, when we look at PED, or price elasticity of demand, we're looking at basically consumers' willingness to pay. If you look at the formula, consumer surplus is simply what we are willing to pay minus what we actually pay. So when the price of a good is what we actually pay, then the willingness to pay is simply price elasticity of demand. Lower the elasticity of demand, higher will be the willingness to pay. And similarly, higher the elasticity of demand, lower will be the willingness to pay. And the reason is very simple, because when your elasticity demand is low, then basically we say that there are not many substitutes available. And if that is the case, then consumers will be willing to pay a higher price because they don't have substitutes to switch if the price of the good changes. Vice versa, if the good is elastic in demand, then one may argue that it has many substitutes available, and because of this availability of substitutes, one may also say that consumers are willing to pay less, and as a result of that, consumer surplus will be lower since you have a lower willingness to pay. Let's now look at two extreme cases, one of a perfectly inelastic good and another one of a perfectly elastic good, and see how consumer surplus will vary with both of these cases. In the case of a perfectly inelastic good, we argue that the consumer is willing to pay any price, because remember, this is a good which has
For a perfectly
no substitute
inelastic
available.
good,
And
we
if that
make
is
a
the
demand
case,
curve
then
that is completely
one may
vertical.
argue that the consumer surplus.
So if you
will
look at
be
the demand
infinite because
curve,
you're willing to pay any
the
price,
demand
your
curve
life
is perfectly
depends on that.
vertical,
So let's see this in terms of a
and
diagram.
this means the consumer is willing to pay any price. Let's say this is my supply curve. My supply curve is upward sloping, and let's say the equilibrium price is P naught. Now, what we are actually paying is P naught, therefore, but what are we willing to pay? And the answer is any price. In that case, all this area will be my consumer surplus. So my consumer surplus in this case is going to be infinite, as I am willing to pay any price. If the supply curve shifts upward or the price goes up for any reason, consumer will still pay the market price because he needs that good. It is important for his survival, and it is a life-saving drug. On the other hand, our second case is of a perfectly elastic good. Now, this is a good which is kind of a good that has a lot of substitutes available. And in the case of a perfectly elastic good, consumer is willing to pay only the market price, let's say P. And since this is the price he actually pays, consumer surplus is zero. Why? Because what you're willing to pay is exactly equal to what you actually pay. If we look at the demand curve for such a good, the demand curve, we said, is perfectly horizontal. Therefore, what you're willing to pay is exactly what the market price is. Let's say P naught, and let's say this is my supply curve. My supply curve, of course, is upward sloping. I get myself this quantity Q naught, and therefore you can see this, that there is no area under the demand curve. This area, by the way, which is under the demand curve above the supply curve, we call this the producer surplus. It's not consumer surplus, because producer is going to supply this good at P naught, but his minimum price is of course this one. So while the consumer surplus is zero, you might have some producer surplus. And what we can make out of this discussion is this idea that when the price elasticity of demand for a good is low, this means the consumers are willing to pay much more. Therefore, the lower the elasticity of demand, the more consumer is willing to pay, and therefore higher will be the consumer surplus. So we have an inverse relationship, therefore, where lower PED or PED falls, we'll say consumer surplus rises. Similarly, we said this earlier also, when the price falls, we saw consumer surplus also rises. So consumer surplus therefore depends on two things. One is what you are actually paying, the price of the good, and therefore there is an inverse relationship. Lower price means higher consumer surplus. And secondly, your willingness to pay, which is elasticity of demand, where we also say this, when the PED falls, the good becomes inelastic, consumer surplus rises.